Without further ado, Solomon Gibson. Sorry, with no.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. So this has been a while coming, and I'd like to thank my person here for all of her assistance in helping with a lot of what you'll see here, because I wouldn't have put nearly the amount of time into this than, than if it hadn't been for some of her work at the beginning. So, as you can see, the title of this is This Is Not America, or Is It? This was, it came out of an opening word from one of the meetings a few weeks ago. It was bolstered by my observations of what's been going on with ICE and immigration, ultimately a lot of the comments around the killing of Rachel Good. And what I tend to notice is that invariably during conflicts like this, whether it's ICE or January 6th or Donald Trump gassing Black Lives Matter or George Floyd, that some commentator or analyst will come out and in making comments about what's going on, will declare that this is not America. And such happened with Rachel Good. And every time I hear that, I look at my TV set or wherever I'm streaming it, and I say, yes, it is. Now I'm talking to no one, but that's my general response to it all. And I always wonder, what they're talking about, what they mean by that, because it always feels so obvious to me. And I feel kind of shortchanged every time that happens. So I related these feelings as opening words and was invited to explore uh, this topic. And as often happens with such explorations, these deep dives can get pretty extensive. I learned a heck of a lot. One of the disclaimers I will say at this point is that saying that what you will see here in this presentation is scratching the surface is a massive understatement. Because any aspect of what's here is a history lesson in and of itself. So I will be giving you some fairly broad strokes and urge you to investigate further on your own at the conclusion. Hopefully you'll have some questions about what's going on, but there will be things in here that, honestly speaking, should be explored about the country itself. So in investigating what people mean when they say that, I never quite know. Um, and so the first thing that I did was to kind of look at what's going on. And what we tend to see at this point in time, does the question mean the violence? Is it the fact that there's an armed militia that is rounding up, attacking people and committing these kind of acts? Detention without due process of the law, that they're just being incarcerated. Ignoring of rights. They never see lawyers and they're just scooped up and sent somewhere. The violations of the law, the fact that the armed militia is working in anonymity, or the gaslighting by leadership. We're not seeing what we're actually seeing. There's something else going on, and we should just ignore our own eyes. These are the general things that are going on, and they tend to go on at these various stages. So, is this what they mean by this is not America? Well, to start out at the beginning, my feeling is these things happen at the very beginning and have been going through history at a fairly regular rate. And so, starting with the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, America's war and the Declaration of Independence from England, Great Britain. the War of 1812, the continuation of America's Declaration of Independence from England. Settlers just didn't want to deal with that anymore and decided they were going to fight for their freedoms. Civil War of 1861 to 1865, well, the country's at war with itself, where one section of the country decides it wants to be independent from the other section and is willing to fight for the right to do that. Hundreds of thousands of people are injured and killed. The Mexican-American War of 1846 is the United States claiming territory that was also being claimed by Mexico for the desire to annex Texas. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was a fight for the continuation of the West Coast of the country. More locally, strong throughout all of this, the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, right here in North Carolina. These next three are essentially institutional violence that are committed because people just aren't happy with things that are going on locally. This happened in Wilmington. They didn't like the interracial nature of the government there and decided, well, we're just not going to deal with it, and completely overthrew the country, actually setting an example for different places throughout the country and what they could do for white supremacy. The Oklahoma City bombing of 1995, where literally a group of guys decided to blow up a federal building, killing several hundred people, men, women, and children, because they just didn't like what was going on. And of course, January 6th, the riot of 2020, which we've all seen that they keep denying was what it was. Strewn throughout just this bit of history was slavery, torture, riots, lynchings, church bombings, and killings throughout the entire history, all between all of this. Black neighborhoods completely decimated, wiped off of the face of the earth due to a lot of this violence. Armed militias, was that not America? Well, armed militias and militias existed almost from the very beginning. They were local part-time citizens, forces for policing and enforcing slavery. They could be sent across states to retrieve slaves that had escaped and keeping them in line. They were active in the American Revolution and the War of 1812, and they were codified by the 1792 Militia Act. So clearly, our militia has been around almost from the very beginning. Acting in anonymity. Well, there are key examples. The government has always had spies. There have been undercover agitators that were planted in. And of course, the KKK was quite prevalent throughout the history of this country. I like this little juxtaposition here because it seems to, exemplify exactly what I'm talking about at this point. Now, I decided to consolidate these three things and decided on this particular example. It's not that these things haven't happened before: detention without due process, incarceration, ignoring rights, and disregarding human life and the law. You can find those throughout American history as well. This case also comes with the disregard for children and how racism, the demonstrations of racism have no age, and the heinous nature to which these things can occur. And if you've never heard of it, I urge you also to look this up. The kissing case in Monroe, North Carolina, 1958. It was off the history books for many, many years. The kissing case of 1958, broadly speaking, two little black boys, David Simpson, age 7, and James Hanover Thompson, age 9, were kissed on the cheek by a little girl who was white because she knew them. They had played in nearby yards because David and James's moms worked for the white parents. And so these children were used to playing with one another, white and black. She saw them at one point, or depending on the story goes, they were finishing up a day of playing games, and she good-naturedly kissed the two boys on the cheek, and they went on their way. Everybody did. She related this innocently to her mom. Her mom blew a gasket, washed her mouth out with lye, apparently. Her father was so upset, he loaded his shotgun, rounded up some friends, and we're going to lynch these two little boys. Fortunately for them, the police got to them first because the mom had called the police and relayed this story. The police got the two little boys off the street, took them to the police station, to the basement, and proceeded to beat them. Accused them of molestation, called them little rapists, and they weren't allowed to see their parents for 6 days. They were brought up on charges in front of a judge who looked at the case. The case was separated into two. The family of the little girl, the boys were brought up on charges and found guilty of that. And then when they finally saw their parents, finally they were brought up on charges. They had no lawyers, no representation, didn't say anything, and the judge decided that their silence was an admission of guilt and sent them off to a reform school until 21. That's what they were charged with, and that was their penalty, their punishment. Fortunately enough, this case garnered national and ultimately international attention. Foreign countries got involved in this case because foreign governments felt it was absolutely appalling that this happened to these two boys just because they were kissed on the cheek. This became so large that it became an embarrassment for the governor of North Carolina. Eleanor Roosevelt got involved talking to President Dwight D. Eisenhower at the time, who, as historians said, got in touch with the governor. The governor pardoned the two boys after 3 months and never apologized without explanation. This to me felt like a perfect example of these three things. Now, as I said, they'd happened many times before in the country. You can find all sorts of examples of this. But this to me seemed to be particularly heinous and is more recent history. So clearly, in the list of things that were presented as to what's going on now, even a casual view of American history demonstrates the fallacy of the statement that this is not America. And so I decided, rather than dealing with these physical proofs, to focus more on the attitude, the psyche. What is it or has it been about our society that allows these things to go on? And I decided to kind of focus on what is the reason that allows these things to happen. Now, you'll notice in that entire list, I never mentioned gaslighting. And the reason for that is how extensive it tends to be. And of course, gaslighting, as many of you know, the manipulation of another into doubting their perceptions and experiences and whatever their understandings that certain events are. And my feeling was, in investigating all of this, that gaslighting is at the very foundation of America. 1776, America declares its independence. 1787, crafting of the Constitution in a room full of men, was ratified the Constitution was ratified in 1787. Contained in that document of democracy, independence, self-governance, and individual freedoms is the Three-Fifths Compromise. Three-Fifths Compromise essentially codifies that the Black people coming into this country were not people, they were property. Three-fifths was established as a way of representation for the South in Congress because, well, those Black folks had some human traits, so they had to be, counted in some way. But still, they were going to be property. And so this compromise basically said, these people are property. It doesn't matter whether or not we're talking democracy, freedom, individual freedom, self-governance, for the people, by the people, of the people. And despite the relationships you may have with these folks, well, they're still just property, and you can treat them as such. Also contained in there is the importation clause. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says that Congress cannot ban slavery in this country for 20 years at that time. They couldn't do anything about slavery till 1808. Now, what they exactly thought would happen, what did happen is they essentially banned importation of new slaves. And this isn't as good as it may sound, because this was quite beneficial for all concerned, even slave owners, since they were breeding slaves. Bringing in more slaves was not necessarily beneficial for the value of their property. And also, overall, you really become concerned with the idea that your slave population may start to get too large and overwhelm your white population. So this one move wasn't necessarily as altruistic as it may seem at first. Also contained is the Fugitive Slave Clause, which in 1787 stipulated that slave states could send militia and go and chase down and retrieve escaped slaves. Now, free states were not mandated to recognize a return of slaves. They didn't have to send them back until 1850, when it was more solidified, where states were mandated to return escaped slaves. And as I began to think of it, I says, 63 years, and it didn't get any better for Black people, it got worse. And so, in my opinion, at that foundation, what you had was a country that said and convinced people that there was a democracy, that there was individual freedom, that it was by the people, of the people, for the people. But it wasn't actually. Blacks couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, Native Americans, well, they weren't even a part of that particular process. And immigrants, well, they weren't voters either. So I don't know how you can convince yourself with essentially the white male minority controlling all the levers of power and wealth. What the framers created in being able to do what they did with the Black population was essentially disregard the humanity of an entire group of people. By doing that, they gave themselves permission and a template, as well as an example of how to disregard the rights of others. You could literally say, as they did, that these people do not matter. This gave them the position of white superiority. And once they stepped over this line and crossed this Rubicon, then they could do that to any group. If you can do it to one group of people and make that decision, you can do it to all. The Indian Removal Act, and that's what happened. That's just what they did, as you can see throughout history. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, what it was a law that provided for the exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories and for their removal west of the Mississippi River. Essentially what it says is that we can take the land that you guys have and we'll give you something elsewhere that we don't want, and we can move you there. This, of course, resulted in the notorious Trail of Tears. Thousands and thousands of the indigenous population were sequestered by foot westward to death, disease, all sorts of horrific things. Once they got west, it eventually wasn't much better. Thanks to the gold rush and the movement of settlers, there became problems with the land out west as settlers wanted to claim it. California gave us the Indian Indentured Act of 1850. What this was is that It was a law that provided for the indenturing of Indian children and adults to whites, and also punishing Indian vagrants by hiring them out for auction to whites. This would help lead to the California Genocide, 1846 to 1873, which was a number of genocidal massacres of the indigenous people in California. And this was done by the United States government, soldiers, and settlers. The Mexican populace didn't suffer much of a better fate. The Anti-Vagrancy Act of 1855 did what the California Massacre and the Indentured Indians Act, the Indian Indentures Act, also did. There were a number of California greaser laws, the derogatory term for the Mexican populace, and these in feel were sort of precursor to Jim Crow laws. They act in the same way, wholesale discrimination. It authorized local militias, remember those guys, to terrorize the Mexican community. It targeted those of Spanish and Indian blood, legalized the harassment and arrest of Mexicans. There was the Mexican Repatriation Act of 1929 to 1939, 300,000 individuals to 2 million were deported. 40 to 60% were estimated to be American citizens. Operation Wetback happened during the Eisenhower administration, which was a law enforcement initiative. And it was a short-lived operation that used military-style tactics to remove Mexican immigrants from the United States. It was a massive apprehension and deportation aimed at undocumented nationals and by the U.S. Border Patrol alongside the Mexican government. So the Mexican government were involved in this for the purposes that they were losing people and workers to the United States. And so they weren't getting the work done in Mexico. A wetback was a derogatory term that was later dismissed, and the program only lasted about a year. Operation Gatekeeper under Bill Clinton came in 1994. Once again, it's another one of those deportation programs that was to restore integrity and safety to the nation's busiest border near San Diego. Operation Gatekeeper has never gone away. It's evolved and they call it something different now. But as you can see, issues with Mexican immigrants has been almost constant. Chinese Americans, the Chinatown Massacre, well, these things were going on as well. This created a number of pieces of legislation. Let's start with the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871. A racial massacre targeting Chinese immigrants and confiscation of their land and property. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the United States federal law signed by Chester A. Arthur, and it prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. Apparently, this was the first type of limitation, official federal limitation on immigration ever in the country. This would lead to any of a number of incursions, including the 1885 Rock Springs, Wyoming massacre. In this particular event, there were riots and resulting massacre of immigrant Chinese miners by European immigrant miners, resulting from racial prejudice toward Chinese who were felt to be taking their jobs. And, well, of course, Black people were fairly consistently discriminated against and attacked. The Red Summer, in particular, of 1919. As you can see, white supremacist terrorism ran rampant throughout the country. Anti-Black racism occurred in more than 36 cities and one rural Arkansas county across the United States. The county is Elaine, Arkansas, by the way. And the reason I brought this out is it demonstrating the degree of racism wasn't just happening in the South. It was happening all over the country. The first example, and of course, I couldn't list all 3 dozen plus examples here, just a few that caught my attention just to show the breadth of what was going on. April 19th, two brothers were tarred and feathered at the University of Maine, which took place in Orono, Maine. July 3rd, the Buffalo Soldiers. It was the 10th Cavalry, originally established, I believe, in 1866, of Black soldiers. And they were attacked in Bisbee, Arizona. July 27th, the Chicago Massacre, which is considered the greatest, one of these incursions, was rioting and killing throughout Chicago in the South Side. The number of fatalities and people affected can be a little imprecise because, well, the tendency was to purge the records of what was going on. So you never quite knew the number. For this particular massacre, the number of people were anywhere from 38 to 50 fatalities, 23 Black, 15 whites. Whites almost never exceeded the number of Blacks in fatalities and injuries during these things. 527 people were injured and 1,000 Black families were left homeless. Other accounts reported 50 people were killed, and unofficial numbers and rumors reporting even more. Labor activist William Z. Foster, among other observers, referred to the killings as an anti-Negro pogrom. Lastly, I wanted just to present this example of John Hartfield. I'm not going to tell you what happened to him, but I urge you to look it up under the Red Summer. What they did to him was so horrific. I would watch it and I'd say, no wonder white people don't want to revisit this. You can almost understand why you'd want to purge the history books of such things. Because, and this wasn't the only example of the kind of treatment that whites could come up with throughout history. But it was a particularly egregious example, given what he had actually done. I believe he swam in a whites-only pool or something like that. As I said before, thanks to what the framers basically allowed to go on and basically said, any group could be targeted for discrimination and violence. The Italians were known as the Chinese of Europe. The Irish were the missing links between Blacks and whites. Japanese Americans were incarcerated without due process for World War II just because of the way they looked. And Jewish people who came into the country felt they needed to hide their identities to avoid discrimination and that kind of violence. And so these things went on all the time. In seeing what the framers had shaped, what they created in allowing slavery during a period where the claim was that there was a democracy and freedom for the people, is they created, in my opinion, a schism, a social and cultural psychosis, where the populace had to create for itself a level of a massive cognitive dissonance that I believe continues to exist today. And so no exploration of the gaslighting of America, as I thought about it, would be complete without the lost cause myth. This, of course, was the narrative that stipulated that the Civil War wasn't what it was. A narrative that shaped history and said in favor of the Confederacy. That the reasons that the war happened, well, really did not happen. The purpose, of course, being the goals of the Confederate States during the Civil War were morally just, heroic, and not centered on maintaining slavery. The term lost cause was first penned by author journalist Edward A. Pollard in his book, The Lost Cause, a New Southern History of the War of Confederates. It was changed from History of the War because its publisher needed something more snappy. And what he states, which I'll tell you in a minute, became kind of the template and the narrative for everything that followed. It diminished the role of the narrative, diminished the roles of slavery in causing the war by stipulating that slaves were content and happy and getting along, and indeed were better off being slaves than if they had been on their own. States' rights was the claim that the federal government and laws were attempting to impose their will on the southern states, on the South, and endangering the Southern way of life. Northern aggression was, of course, those Northerners were trying to force us to do things that were unconstitutional, that we shouldn't be doing, that we don't want to be doing. And they're going to do it, by attacking us. The South was defending itself in this narrative. Now, I wanted to give the quote from Pollard's book that, kind of says it all, and would be repeated by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. We shall not enter upon the discussion of the moral question of slavery, but we may suggest a doubt here whether that odious term slavery, which has been so long imposed by the exaggeration of Northern writers upon the judgment and sympathies of the world, is proper of servitude in the South, which was really the mildest in the world, which did not rest on acts of debasement and disenfranchisement, but elevated the African and was in the interest of human improvement, and which, by the law of the land, protected the Negro in life and limb and in many personal rights, and by the practice of the system, bestowed upon him a sum of individual indulgences which made him altogether the most striking type in the world of cheerfulness and contentment. Yeah, they said that. Clearly, there's no real fact to that. What continued with the Lost Cause narrative in 1894, the United Daughters of the Confederacy came into existence. Following the Civil War and the South being so emotionally debilitated and depressed by its outcome, promoted the creation of this lost cause. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy came up and decided that it was their job to spread the word of the true history of the South. And they were effective at doing it. They were central in the erection of numerous Confederate monuments across the South. See one here that Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson. I think that's the Confederate, what did I say it was? Yes, it's Stone Mountain, Georgia, and it's the Confederate Mount Rushmore for all intents and purposes. They aimed to ensure the correct history of the South was taught, exerting control over public school textbooks to promote a pro-Confederate, often white supremacist perspective. And we were all certainly exposed to that. I assume we're all from the same generation that had no mention whatsoever of slavery in the history books. I didn't take a single class that ever mentioned it. It started with George Washington, Abe Lincoln, some Ben Franklin, and then we skipped on to World War I think it was. Everything else wasn't there or was kind of glossed over. You can thank the UDC for that because they worked diligently to get the textbooks altered for this very purpose, and it worked. It's interesting to note that I don't know of any other time or any other place where the losers of a war get to dictate its results and reshape its history. Don't know, other than America, and by and large, unfortunately, usually white folks. Um, and so that was the lost cause narrative, probably the second biggest level of gaslighting in America. And this narrative continues today. We've all heard it. We've all heard people saying these very things, including secession of Texas due to the 10th Amendment. That was also stated as a reason for the South seceding from the Union. So with all of this clearly being a part of American history, why does this kind of continue? Why is this still allowed? Why are people in certain ways kind of accepting of some of the behavior that we have seen time and time and time and time again? But in many of these cases that I've explained, there was no justice. In fact, law enforcement and institutions were fine with a lot of these things that's going on. So what makes that kind of immorality okay for people to indulge in? And as I said before, the framers created a kind of schism. And so the first question is, what causes that schism, that sort of conflict between the moral and the immoral, that cognitive dissonance? Many years ago when I was a youth, I'm very young, I came across a statement similar to this. There's several corollaries to it, one of them being everyone is a hero of their own story. It's a little bit different. I like this one. I probably massaged what I originally read, but this is what I landed on. Psychologically, a person cannot see themselves as a villain in their own eyes. What, of course, it means is that if you do something you feel is questionable or immoral, you have to figure out a reason why you're doing it. Good people doing bad things have to figure out some way to justify them. And we see that all the time. Usually with people, it's through dehumanization or fear. You're going to be attacked. Something's going to happen to you, your family, your friends. You need to do something about it. But in this particular case, there is another reason, particularly at that time, that it could be argued satisfied dealing with some of that schism. And that is in 1845, a conservative journalist by the name of John L. O'Sullivan coined this term, manifest destiny. Now, in short, what it is, it's a belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the North American continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so this is not, of course, the first version of this idea. The idea of being ordained, that God or your gods have given you permission or the purpose of doing the heinous or questionable things you're doing, has been around for as long as there have been conquerors. It's basically monarchs, conquerors have always declared that God said I could do this. Historian William Earl Weeks said that there were three basic tenets to manifest destiny: the assumption of the unique moral virtue of America, the assertion of its mission to redeem the world by the spread of Republican government, and more generally, the American way of life, and the faith of the nation's divinely ordained destiny to succeed in its mission. These would translate into the divine mission, Americans believing granted them the right and duty to spread liberty, democracy, and self-government across the continent and the world. American superiority, the belief that American institutions and cultures were superior, justifying their imposition on others, American exceptionalism, white nationalism, and racism. and inevitable expansion, which is most associated with the manifest destiny. And that is expansion is seen as both clear and certain future for the mission, divine providence. This would be responsible for the westward expansion. Indian relocation, Louisiana Purchase, annexation of Texas, the expansion into the Oregon boundaries, the California Gold Rush, as well as the Alaska Purchase and the overthrow and annexation of Hawaii. It continued right up into the 50s. And this would all lead to the acquisition of vast territories and justify the forced removal and displacement and destruction of native tribes and cultures. The concept of manifest destiny was used by conservatives to justify the annexation of Texas in 1845, the Oregon boundary dispute in 1846, and the philosophy intensified conflicts over slavery when new territories were added. What was the new territory going to be, slave or free? There were constant arguments about that. We compare this to today because, most notably, this term was used in Donald Trump's inauguration speech. The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars. Okay. And we have the examples that the current administration has been tossing around. The purchase of Greenland, which mirrors the Louisiana and Alaska purchases. The annexation of Canada and Mexico, of course, the annexation of Texas and Hawaii, and going to war over these lands. All done before. So why does manifest destiny continue to resonate even today? And honestly, it's seductive. It appeals to the ego. We all have it to some level. It's very seductive to believe that we're a part of something bigger than ourselves, to be involved. I mean, we're all here ethical people. What is that if not helping the world? Certainly not just our family and our friends. We're looking at bigger things. And that appeals to us. Now, we don't take it to the extremes of the type of harm that is used for these kind of things, but it does resonate within every single one of us to do something larger than ourselves and know that what we're doing is right. It gives you freedom to pursue questionable goals. Obviously, if God tells you that you can do it, it must be all right. Gives confidence in the righteousness of those goals. Once again, God says you can do these things. In fact, it is your purpose to do these things. Then how can you not have confidence in that? And it offers simplicity. God says it, do it. It's good. You don't have to think about it. And we see these things resonating even today. So this brings us back to the statement, this is not America, and trying to understand why it is said or shouldn't be said. Clearly, whatever is going on right now is a part of what has gone on in America. And so the notion is, why say that? You don't want to acknowledge all of the things that happened. When I looked at that phrase, one of the things I thought about is that it ignores American history. It ignores what happened to the indigenous population, to Blacks, to Hispanics, even to women. It is denying the experience of women and people of color. Now, it lessens the guilt that we have having advantage from that suffering. Everything we experience in our life today, and the luxuries and leisures and whatever we're doing and going about our lives, started then. Started with those guys that said, you know what, we're going to say that these people have no rights, and are property. And we're going to build an economy on that and consistently do it. Whenever Black people manage to acquire something, and I urge you to look up I just read the Wilmington Massacre. Small town, it kind of was flourishing and interracial. And the white supremacists there said, nah, we're not going to be doing this. We're just going to, and would burn Black businesses and just read the Red Summer. These things would happen. But this is not America means that we can lessen the guilt about all of that, that we're somehow, getting benefits from a lot of that horror. But ultimately, when I came down to it in a more positive view, what I felt is that by not admitting what had gone on before, by saying that this is not America, and what that means is that somehow what's going on now is unique to what is America, is that limits our ability to become all those things that we aspire to be. All of that freedom, individual liberty, the ability to make these choices. It prevents us from getting to that point. I tended to compare it to almost like Alcoholics Anonymous or one of those things, is that you've got to admit your sins before you can move forward. And we find ourselves in this same thing over and over and over and over and over again. Exactly what is going on today. Militias rounding up people, rounding up citizens and scooping them up and sequestering them off somewhere we know not where. Innocent white people getting killed in the melee. Look up Mississippi burning. That happens in trying to change these things. And of course, the same people are elevated to the top that are also getting in the way of all these things. And the statement, "This is not America," does not help us move forward in getting what we need to become the country we have always been promised we were supposed to be. And so, based on my inspection of everything that I managed to research, I found the statement to be pretty much exactly what I felt it was. That this is America, and we need to do something about it. Once we can admit that, we can actually start to dig down and maybe prevent some of this stuff from happening, to get off of this treadmill that we always seem to be on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Solomon. That was a wonderful presentation and makes a lot of sense of things. We'll, sorry, have to get to my place here. Our society is an all-volunteer organization. We receive no money from any other organization. We survive due to your commitment to our common goals. So we will pass the baskets, except
Actually, we're
we're not.
rate things rather than passing the basket and having a separate change for change jar. What we're doing is we have the basket on the table by the door, and the money that you all choose to donate into that basket goes straight towards. We'll check with Chris, double check with him and Solomon and Stan, but it's either Ethical Action or is it one of the charities that we're sort of looking at? Ethical Action, because we kind of felt like there's a lot of people who, well, there's some people who actually pledge. And so they pledge money and they pay money, and then we pass a basket around saying, hey, we want some more. So rather than doing that every Sunday, we're just going to point people towards the ethical action basket by the door.
Okay, thank you. Um, I will rearrange my script. Now we will pass the mic for questions, and I want to recognize all who have questions, but please keep them brief, and we will have people take turns. I'm going to ask a question first, though. Get mine in. I've always been told that the references to inclusion of slavery and everything in the Constitution was a way to get everybody on board, that it wouldn't have passed without those provisions. Did you run across anything that would indicate that there was a way to get it done?
I hadn't read anything different than that. Um, because, well, a lot of those guys had their wealth in slaves. And so, you- honestly, you get people into a room, nobody was going to write something that disadvantaged themselves. And it was seen as a way to, one, wealth and bolster a new economy. It was quick and easy. Um, I thought about that and came to what I thought was an interesting conclusion. And that is, interestingly enough, that becomes a part of the manifest destiny idea. The assumption, and we all kind of have, that America needed to exist for whatever reason, because if they had decided to not indulge in that kind of immorality, and if in truth America did not come into being as it were, what would have happened? We don't know. There were certainly throughout the world a number of systems that were flourishing. And right here, the indigenous population was thriving, had been for ages. So the idea that somehow America had to exist, and so doing that was kind of the cost of doing business. Absolving those guys for saying, well, if we don't do this, there won't be an America. Okay, but I don't know. It's not objective. There's no way you can tell whether or not the world would have been better off.
So my comment actually was similar to Jan's, because to me the 3/5 rule was not so much to say these folks were property, because that was already established that they were considered property, but to basically give the Southerners more power based on their wealth and counting their property, but we're going to count them as people for purposes of giving the South some political power. So I think it was sort of similar to what Jan said. It was to get the Constitution through, and the two systems that were developing were quite different, and they had to do something about it. But I think it also, brings up the through line of capitalism here, because it, it was the accrual of wealth that was clearly a really founding principle of our country, because unlike Europe, where people had real restraints, or unlike the undeveloped world where people were still living in a different kind of society, America was positioned to be able to just blow up in terms of wealth. And that was on the backs of indigenous people and Black people, et cetera. Can I make one other comment and then so I read a book a few years ago that made a big impression on me, which was called The Half Has Never Been Told. And it was written actually by a white historian, but it was about how slavery changed and became crueler and crueler and crueler. So, we look at Jefferson's time and we see some family connections and maybe a certain type of slavery, but you go up, 80 years and things are much tougher. And that just made a big impression on me that just became more and more tough because they were extracting wealth, as much wealth as they could. And so the cotton gin and everything else made it harder.
Well, the example I used with the fugitive slave clause, which started in 1787 and 1850 became worse than what was going on. The Three-Fifths Compromise, as a practical matter, yes, did exactly what the two of you have said. The issue that I present here is that whether or not the motivation, one, the notion that America had to be created. These folks were coming onto land they did not really, and pushing the people who lived there off of them. So that was already questionable. But what they eventually did in parsing this all up was to simply say, we're going to sacrifice a bunch of folks. No matter how you slice it, that's the decision they made. They said, these people are going to be sacrificed. And they're not going to be people, they're going to be property, they're going to be property for wealth and for the South to come on board. Because it wasn't beneficial to the North to apply the Three-Fifths Compromise, really. They could have stuck with, well, no, they're property, you say they're property, so they can't count. And gone that route. But yes, this is what they had to do, but they essentially codified slavery into the document of the free, and found a reason why they could constantly say we had to do it, rather than it's evil or immoral. Well, we just had to do it.
Hello, Solomon. Interesting, very interesting presentation. Thanks. A couple of points I want to make. One is safety. You talk about all the issues, litany of issues that has plagued the United States over all these years, and talk about gaslighting over all of these issues. Now, even after 250 years, almost 250 years, doesn't this concept of become what we have aspired to be also gaslighting?
I don't think so. The reason aspiration isn't gaslight. What I may want to be tomorrow is completely legitimate. I want better tomorrow than I was today. Now, the gaslighting comes as I'm just going to be a horrible person better tomorrow. And, despite the evidence you see, I'm actually a good person. That would kind of be gaslighting. The aspirations are a goal. Now, whether or not we can get there, we haven't yet and haven't really come close. We always talk about, well, we're losing our democracy. And that's another phrase I look at and I balk at and says, you know what? This was not a democracy. Only white males could vote and they shaped the whole thing. I don't know how you define that as a democracy, but we keep doing it over and over and over again. Now, we have the capability of doing it. I mean, it's all kind of written down. And so the goals aren't the problem. The aspiration is not the problem. The actions that we do or don't do are the issues.
Wow. It's almost hard to ask a question after you've answered one. Your talk was fantastic. I wanted to just make a couple of comments. First of all, in regards to the North and the South having sort of different systems, they were pretty connected because all that cotton and so forth that the South was putting out on the backs of slaves was then going to the North and some of the more industrial areas and getting used. So the northern people, northern states were not they certainly didn't benefit as much by the 3/5 clause. That was definitely a sop to the Southerners. But they were part of that same economic system, I think. Um, but one other thing about the slavery is that, this really dumbass thing about happy slaves, which just makes me insane because American slavery was some of the worst slavery we've had in history. If you go back like 1,000, 2,000 years ago, a lot of times people went into slavery sort of like they did into indentured servitude and had a reasonable chance of buying their way out. That wasn't going to happen here. I mean, there were a very, very few examples of that happening, but almost never. And the other thing I just wanted to say, that this is not America and ignoring American history. I have a friend who's pretty progressive, but she thinks, well, maybe not all these hard things should be taught in school. And it's like, if people don't know where they came from, how can you go to where you want to go? And to me, that's the bottom line. If we're going to get better, we have to acknowledge what we have done wrong to get better and to do it more right.
True. My last point. Now, I will respond by saying I understand why you don't want to visit, why, the country doesn't want to visit there. Because some pretty horrific things happen. I didn't have to read what I wrote, what I saw to kind of understand that it was pretty bad. And anything anyone said that America had done didn't have to prove it to me. I'd say, oh, you did that? Yeah, I believe it. But once you kind of delve into it and you start to read some of this stuff, um, my thought was, holy mackerel, what was the matter with white people? It because I mean, the fact is you won't find this kind of behavior happening for blacks doing it to whites or Hispanics doing it to whites or, any of that stuff. All of this stuff, every lick of it was done by white people for whatever various reasons, usually because they felt they could get away with it. And I'm sorry for all of you who are my friends here for being a part of that group. But once you read it, it's uh,
I've got a question and a comment, I think, from the Zoom attendees. I'm going to go ahead and pose both of them for the sake of time. Fred basically is asking, can any country ever live up to its ideals? So he's asking that question. And then John Holmgren is pointing out that the phrase, this is not America, um, is true for many of us, he says, because we were brought up to ignore the unpleasant truths of U.S. history. Um, so that's John's comment, and I'll throw my own comment in there. I love the David Bowie's "This Is Not America," his song, I think back from 2017, but I think again that ignores the whole history of the U.S. So you can feel free to comment, obviously, about what Fred asked or what John said.
yeah, well, John's comment is an example of, skipping over American history. Fred's question, typical of Fred, of course. Can any country grow to the point of what it aspires? I don't know. I know it's important that we have these aspirations. Otherwise, why bother to do anything? But no, I don't know whether or not, it takes a lot of effort and it takes sacrifice. That's all I can say about it. Thank you, everybody. Oh,
So speaker sound during refreshment time, please. And maybe we can have more conversations like this. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Yeah, and sorry for not getting to everybody, but we're at least 10 minutes past the time we should have closed it. Is it now time for announcements? Any announcements, programming?
We are not meeting next week. We're not meeting here nor in via Zoom. Our next meeting after today will be March 1st. We have a speaker for that day. It's representatives from Pee Wee Homes, which is in Carborough. They're going to speak to us about what they do, basically small, tiny houses for the poor, but they'll tell us all about that. So that's a bit, will be our next program.
Okay. Anything else? Amy has closing words for us?
I don't need you.
This is going to be a little more lighthearted. As you know, I like Billy Collins a lot. And this one is called The Hunt. Somewhere in the rolling hills and farm country that lie beyond speech, Noah Webster and his assistants are moving across the landscape, tracking down a new word. It is a small noun about the size of a mouse, one that will be seldom used by anyone, like a synonym for isthmus, but they are pursuing the creature zealously as if it were the verb to be, swinging their sticks and calling out to one another as they wade through a field of waist-high barley. So this put me in mind of the neologisms for 2025. And I have a little list of things that Noah Webster might have been looking for. Slop, which is the Merriam-Webster word of the year for 2025. It refers to the glut of low-quality AI-generated text, images, and video, signaling frustration with digital quality control. Then rage bait is the Oxford word of the year. Parasocial is the Cambridge Dictionary word of the year. Broligarchy, I think we've all heard that one. 67, heard that. Prompt Smith is a skilled user who can effectively guide AI to produce high quality results. We might wonder about that. Climavore is someone whose diet is chosen based on environmental impact. I have some of those in my neighborhood. And then side questing is taking on unexpected minor tasks or detours in daily life.
Thank you, Amy, for doing opening and closing words, Stevie Jane for being our greeter, Chris for our technical person. Who am I missing? Gretchen for refreshments. Can't forget that. Well, yes, Solomon for speaking. And for those of you, I'm sorry, who I cut off, please ask your questions and share. All right. Our meeting is over, but our fellowship continues. So turn to someone with a kind greeting and enjoy the refreshments. Thank you.